Welcome to this virtual service of the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Georgetown, Texas. My name is Snead. I'm a retired Presbyterian minister who has been actively involved, along with my wife, Michelle, in this congregation for the past 7 years. We are among those in our community who have found a spiritual home in this Unitarian Universalist Fellowship because of its social justice emphasis. You can learn more about San Gabriel UU and our ministry by looking for information on the congregation's website. You'll find that information posted at the end of the service today. Today, as we begin the month of September, we'll be celebrating tomorrow Labor Day in our nation. This is the day in the year where we celebrate the contributions that workers and laborers make, not only to their own well-being, but also to the economic prosperity and well-being of our nation as well. This is the time for us today to do a little reflection on labor, this celebration of the value of work. It's deeply rooted, of course, in our American culture, going back to Puritan beliefs about the benefits of work for both individuals and for society. The American myth of that hard work, in particular, will bring riches and respect for all of us, was promoted actually in the mid-19th century by stories written by the one-time Unitarian minister Horatio Alger. This same idea was reinforced in the Protestant work ethic later, as seen as a foundation for capitalism. And the ideology about these benefits that come from working hard is carried on sometimes with negative beliefs as well about those who live in poverty, with the thinking that somehow they are lazy and indolent. In this service this morning, I'm going to invite you, along with our congregation, to explore the truth about some of these beliefs about value of work and whose labor should we be celebrating in this most prosperous nation in the world today. We welcome you to this service. Thanks for joining us.
To light a chalice in the dark, that some may find their way, to act in love though it be hard, put fear and pride away, to welcome all, to answer need, to search for truth where it may lead, to honor faith with dignity. This is our humble creed. This is our only creed.
Join us in singing When Our Heart is in a Holy Place.
Good morning. It's lovely to be with you today. And it's wonderful to be sharing a Wonder Box again. It's been a little while. What could be in here? Have you brought a wondering mind that will help you figure out what might be in here? I'm going to shake it. Fairly loud, fairly heavy today. Let's open it up and see. Flashlight. When do you use a flashlight? Usually at night when it's hard to see. Most of us are asleep at night, but guess what? There is a lot that goes on while we are sleeping. People working through the night, making all of our lives better. And I've got a story about that. It's called
Night Job, written by Karen Hess, illustrated by G. Brian Karras, shared with permission from Candlewick Press. On Friday nights, when the sun goes down, I snap the clip shut on Dad's lunchbox and climb onto the back of his bike. We zoom over the darkening bay, riding the dusky highway. For a while, the air stinks of old fish, but at the school, it smells like lilacs. We pull into our space. Dad hauls out a ring of keys as big as the rising moon. He opens the door and the building sighs. "Come," it whispers to us. We start in the gym, flipping on the first and last in the row of switches. I shoot baskets in the half light, the ball bouncing in time with the shoosh of Dad's broom. Our radio travels with us from room to room. We scrub the cafeteria, then sweep the stage while listening to a game played miles away, where the sun is shining on an emerald field in a stadium filled with people eating hot dogs and peanuts and drinking lemonade. We tack back and forth down the hallway, sweeping the school from stem to stern. At 10, Dad leads the way to the courtyard where we unwrap our egg salad sandwiches. We take big bites that fill our mouths and chew until there are only crumbs left, and then we chew those too. As Dad polishes the library, I stretch out on the green vinyl sofa and read aloud to him until I fall asleep. It's 4 a.m. when Dad wakes me and helps me into my jacket. We close the door behind us. The cool air jolts us awake as we roar toward home. Deer startle. A skunk raises its tail. But Dad revs his bike, and we fly over the brightening bay, the two of us airborne, hooting, making the fishermen shake their heads and frown. Dad shifts into neutral half a block from home as we glide silently into our spot. The day lightens and Dad yawns. I head to the kitchen to clean out Dad's lunchbox. By the time the sun bursts out of the sea, Dad has nodded off in the big recliner. "Come," the chair whispers. I climb up beside Dad, and soon we are drifting away together. Riding a watery highway on a rising swell of dreams. The end.
You know, I love the idea of magic and magical things, but in this world, most things don't happen by magic. They happen because of someone's hard work. I encourage you to think about how your life and the things in it are connected to other people through their labor, through their work. So who grew the food you eat? And how did it get to your table? Who sewed the clothes you wear? Who washed them? And yes, who cleaned the school, the restaurant, the library, the doctor's office? Think about these people with gratitude and make sure that they are paid well for their labor. That's something we want to focus and lift up on Labor Day, is that people are worthy of their labor and should be paid well for that, no matter what kind of work it is. You know what I liked about the story? The boy helped his dad in his work. That really struck me. In RE time today, we'll talk more about how we can help one another in our work. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.
So, who has helped you to think carefully about labor and the value of work? Let me make a suggestion to you this morning. I want to suggest that we think about a story that Jesus of Nazareth told. According to the New Testament witness, at least, Jesus often talked about what we might call the morality of economics. He expressed his spiritual insights about poverty and wealth through the stories that he often told. You thumb through the New Testament, you can find a number of these. Story of the rich young ruler, the parable of the pounds. He told a story about the unjust steward, and the story about the rich man and Lazarus. The story of rich man and Lazarus in particular is worth remembering now during our current economic struggle and this pandemic, which has exposed a lot of difficulties within our own system because of our own dependence on those that we now are referring to as essential workers. Let's be honest. This recent recognition and celebration of essential workers is actually a half-hearted euphemism for the work performed by low-paid hourly workers who keep the grocery stores functioning, who care for the aged and the sick, who provide most of the services that we depend on, and who do the dirty jobs that most of us don't want to do. For those of you who may not know this story, let me quickly summarize it for you. Jesus describes a rich man living in a large mansion who is enjoying all of the good things in life, from fine clothing to fine dining. And he says that there's a poor man named Lazarus lying at the gates of the mansion of the rich man, who's hungry and he's covered with sores. And Jesus suggests that Lazarus was there at the rich man's gate in hopes that he might find some of the rich man's discarded food to live on, and for the dogs to lick his sores to give him some relief. In time, Jesus imagined that both Lazarus and the rich man die. Lazarus is carried off, according to Jesus, to be with the eternal life with Abraham, the father of Israel, emblematic of the tradition that has gone ahead of people of faith. The rich man, however, ends up, according to Jesus, being tormented in the fires of hell. In this eternal condition, the rich man can see Lazarus sitting up with the father Abraham, enjoying the company of heaven. And so the rich man asked Father Abraham to have mercy on him and to let Lazarus come down and bring a drop of water to put it on his tongue to ease his misery. Then comes this accounting for the reversal of eternal conditions between the once rich and the once poor. Jesus has Father Abraham saying, remember during your lifetime you enjoyed the good things while Lazarus suffered in want? But now there's a chasm here between you two that cannot be crossed. So the rich man in turn begs Father Abraham to send Lazarus now to warn his brothers who are still living about the eternal consequences of simply ignoring the poor. And again, Father Abraham responds by saying that they've already been given God's word about loving your neighbor and strengthening the hand of the poor. And then comes this indictment. If they do not heed the moral responsibility that's already been given, nothing, no encouragement from heaven will help them. The point of this story is troubling in that Jesus suggests that the differences that exist between the rich and poor in life became a fixed chasm that divided them forever with no hope of redemption. I take this story to mean that the accumulation of wealth by some who, while ignoring others living in poverty, has lasting consequences. Do you think this is true? Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, evidently does. Look at this summary of the stark and uncomfortable facts about the U.S. economy today that Stiglitz outlines. He sees that income growth in the U.S. in the past decade has really flowed to the top 1% of the nation's income distribution. He says this has led to unprecedented income inequality for the most prosperous nation. Those at the bottom and the middle are actually worse off today than they were at the beginning of this century. Inequality in wealth today is even greater than inequality in incomes. Our economic inequalities show up not only in incomes, but in standards of living and health and racial differences. And he even says that these economic differences, what we might call the economic divide or this chasm, is actually threatening our way of democracy. The economic realities that Stiglitz sees today seem to reflect these implications of Jesus' story about that chasm between the rich man and Lazarus. In every generation, the consequences of this kind of economic divide between the rich and the poor has been both morally incomprehensible and ultimately disastrous for us as a nation. As Stiglitz notes about this contemporary example of a divide, it's not a pretty picture. He says countries where the rich live in high-gated communities, weighted on by the hordes of low-income workers with unstable political systems, addicted to wielding partisan power and displaying the absence of hope among the masses, such nations do not last. Meanwhile, many of us who have managed to enjoy some of the prosperity of our nation, we continue, it seems, to protect this notion of laissez-faire, hands-off economics, with the myth that this economic system really enables all boats to rise, even when it's becoming more and more evident that not all boats are being lifted. If Jesus and Stiglitz were to have a conversation, I suspect that they would agree that our Labor Day challenge here in 2021 is as much a moral issue today as it is an economic issue. It's a moral issue when some of us who benefit from the labor of others conveniently insist that each of us is responsible only for our own economic well-being. It's a moral issue when we are content to support an economic system that pays its workers poverty wages, that keeps them from having adequate housing or health care or sense of security. It's a moral issue when whites deny that our racial identity and systemic racism have given us advantages over people of color. It's a moral issue when we measure prosperity only in terms of how well we individually are doing. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to suggest that rich people are inherently bad who ignore the plight of the poor and enjoy their wealth. I am suggesting that too many of us who are managing to enjoy prosperity have bought into these economic myths that perpetuate these gross economic inequalities. So what are these myths? First of all, there's the myth about the scarcity of resources that really feeds a fear that there's not enough of the good things for everybody to go around. This myth shows up in what we might call zero-sum economics, which believes that if you get something, then I necessarily must be losing something. This idea seems to thrive on economic competition that pits workers against other workers at all levels. It was these gross distortions in wealth and the accumulation of wealth and poverty and free market capitalism that created what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels decided to question about the whole economic system of capitalism. Another of today's popular myths is that we tend to want to perpetuate more is this economic divide between the rich and the poor, is the belief that paying workers a living wage rather than a minimum or prevailing wage will somehow necessarily increase unemployment and will hurt the overall economy. The other great myth underlying this economic divide is the belief that business owners, the investors, the corporate leaders deserve as much as they can get of the profits, with little regard for how the lowest paid workers are faring. Modern history indicates that these myths have produced at various times an immoral economic divide between the rich and the poor. The Princeton economist Paul Krugman, for instance, has noted that at the turn of the 20th century, this economic divide in America was grotesquely wide, with the super rich, the Mellons, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, and all of the others who created this kind of industrial monopolies. And then the Great Depression came, and everyone was suddenly suffering the same economic consequences, a kind of economic leveling effect on our nation. And in the midst of this, to avoid these extremes in wealth, a host of government policies were put into place in the 1930s to break up these monopolies, to create social safety nets for workers, to establish minimum wages, and to keep corporations from preying on workers. In the past 50 years, we've seen now a political shift away from the concerns about these wealth disparities and the plight of the working poor. And now we've returned again, it seems, to trusting the economic benefits of this hands-off, laissez-faire capitalism. By any measure, the economic chasm in America has once again grown to troubling and even immoral levels. Wealth in this country promotes equality, but it continues to concentrate at the top, where the wealthiest 10% of American households now control upwards of 75% of the whole household net worth. The middle class is shrinking, and the previously thriving metro areas now have been hit hard again with poverty. With the gross domestic product per capita income of $53,000 plus and an unemployment rate of 4.4%, the U.S. economy for a lot of people appears to be healthy. But the benefits of this strong economy are not evenly enjoyed by all Americans. One of the 325 million Americans, an estimated 17% live below the poverty line. This chasm between the haves and the have-nots today has become almost obscene in terms of accumulated wealth and incomes. It's estimated that billionaires today add upwards to 50% to their overall wealth during pandemics like we've experienced, while low-paid essential workers have less than $400 on average in their savings. The compensation differentials between the highest paid employees and the lowest paid employees in American business has grown steadily over the last 5 decades. So those at the bottom of the economic pile have been increasingly pushed more and more into the poorhouse, while corporate leaders today often earn 200 times more than their lowest paid workers. So what has happened to the value of labor in America's workplace? Once again, it's taken really a national crisis for us to see the problems with these gross economic inequalities. According to the Brookings Institute, the COVID-19 pandemic has inspired an outpouring of gratitude for essential workers whose critical and often low-paid work has kept the country functioning while risking their own health to this virus. Now employers of low-wage workers are struggling to hire workers today because the low-wage workers no longer will work for poverty wages. Suddenly, there's a movement now in Washington to suggest that it's not enough to praise essential workers. We must pay them better. So now Congress is considering raising the federal minimum wage from $7.25, where it's been stuck for more than 20 years, to $15 an hour. Raises the question of whose labor are we now talking about? The value of low-wage worker labor is under careful scrutiny. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics indicates that essential workers comprise approximately half, 47% of all workers in occupations with a median wage of less than $15 an hour. Over half. The COVID-19 pandemic has spotlighted the indignity and the danger that millions of essential workers face as they perform their jobs that are vital to our country without earning enough of a wage to allow them to meet their own basic needs and expenses. Even as low-wage essential workers perform their jobs to allow the rest of us to survive, their meager pay makes it difficult for many of them to escape poverty. Now, public opinion surveys show that support for a higher minimum wage has grown actually during this pandemic. Our partisan divided country, it seems, the majority of Americans today say they support a $15 an hour minimum wage. more and more of us seem to be recognizing the flaws in these economic myths about guaranteed benefits that come from working hard and in the ethical commitments of businesses and corporations to put people ahead of profits. The financial struggles facing lower wage workers have called attention to the necessity of considering now living wages for all workers rather than minimum wages that the marketplace may dictate. So, what is the living wage? The question still remains. Will more employers decide to sacrifice increasing profits in order to raise the wages of their lowest paid workers on whose labor their business depends? Will they do this without legislation requiring them to do so? Well, a few large retail employers like Costco and Target, Best Buy and Amazon have already voluntarily raised their starting wage for frontline employees to $15 per hour. A recent study, however, of the 13 of the biggest retail and grocery stores in the country revealed that they made an additional $17.7 billion in profits during and largely because of the pandemic. Yet few of these companies shared those windfall profits with or through hazard pays for any of their lower wage workers. Researchers at the Economic Policy Institute estimated that raising pay for 32 million lower wage workers would reduce government expenditures on public assistance programs between $13.4 and $31 billion annually, thus ending what many see as corporate welfare. Moreover, there's a raft of research that indicates that there is an overall economic risk of widespread job losses if you increase this to $15 an hour. So now we're looking at this supply and demand by employers from a larger perspective. So we're being asked to consider the value of labor, particularly for our lowest paid essential workers. In many respects, I suggest this wage issue leads us back to the story that Jesus told about the implication of this chasm that exists between the rich and the poor. What about you? Is the value of someone's work a spiritual or moral issue in your way of thinking? Surprisingly, I found this statement by a well-known economist that suggests the value of labor is a moral issue because it reveals the interconnectedness of all of our lives. So as we prepare to celebrate another Labor Day here in America, what do you see as some of the spiritual and moral issues in terms of how we pay people? Well, here in Georgetown, there's now a group of faith community folks who have come together to talk about how we might promote this idea of living wages in Georgetown. Chuck Collins and I have been a part of this effort to create a nonprofit organization called Prosperous Georgetown to develop this kind of living wage initiative among businesses and consumers here in our community. The idea was to establish this living wage in Georgetown. It's similar to what's going on around the country and other places. Living wages always seem to depend on, most of all, the cost of housing in any particular region or locale. cost of housing seems to be the most significant driver. Here in Georgetown, when housing is expensive, like it is in much of the central Texas around Austin metro area, the calculations show that a living wage for a single person to afford to live in a one-bedroom apartment would be $19 an hour. That's considerably more than the current, prevailing wages of whether it's $12 an hour or even now moving up to $15 an hour. The idea of establishing a living wage certification program we've discovered from other communities who've worked on this kind of initiative says that we should ask businesses to raise their current prevailing wages to these living wages of $19 an hour, not just in 1 year or one moment, but over a period of time. So deliberately they're working towards a living wage. So that will help the employees provide for their basic needs, including housing in the city. Prosperous Georgetown will be asking employers of all sizes to make a commitment to raise the prevailing wages over a period of time. But that will require those of us who are consumers, who shop in the businesses, to be willing to shop at places who make that kind of commitment to pay a living wage rather than prevailing wage. Is it realistic to expect employers of all types to increase the standard? Well, no, not every employer can do that immediately. This will take some time. This is an incentive program, consumer education, and a willingness to pay a little more for goods and services at those businesses who promise and make a commitment to do this is a key component in this economic initiative. So we're left today with this implications of this story that Jesus told about a rich man and Lazarus, and wondering why the early church decided to include this particular story of all stories in the New Testament. More importantly, do you believe that every worker in America deserves to be paid a living wage for their labor? And maybe even more than this, are you willing to pay for the goods and services of businesses who are willing to pay a living wage to their employers? I pray that you will consider these as moral and spiritual issues for our time on Labor Day. Thank you.
The light of inspiration's flame shines on within our hearts. Extinguished here, illumined there, in service love imparts. To welcome all, to answer need, to search for truth where it may lead. To honor faith with dignity, this is our humble creed. This is our own